Lila, a talented street musician, sings in a bustling train station to raise money for her ailing mother. Her life takes a dark turn when she accepts an offer from the mysterious Mr. Graves. As Lila is drawn deeper into Graves' world, she begins to unravel secrets that not only threaten her safety but also reveal shocking truths about her past. Lila's voice rose above the hum of the bustling train station, a melody sweet enough to soften even the harshest of commuters. Every evening, as the world rushed by, Lila stood in her usual spot, a worn guitar in hand, her hat on the ground collecting whatever change passers-by were willing to part with. At just 24, she had the kind of beauty that turned heads, soft, chestnut hair that framed a heart-shaped face, eyes a deep shade of green that hinted at secrets, and a voice that could pull at the strings of even the most hardened heart. But it was the sadness in those eyes that lingered in the memory, a sorrow that even her songs couldn't fully hide. Her music was more than just a passion, it was a lifeline. Every note, every lyric was a prayer sent up in hope that she could scrape together enough money to keep her mother's treatments going. Evelyn had always been Lila's rock, her guiding light through the storm. Now the roles had reversed, and it was Lila who found herself battling the relentless tide of medical bills that seemed to pile higher each day. Lila's life had never been easy. She grew up in a small, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, her mother working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. They had no one else, her father had walked out before she was old enough to remember his face. It was always just the two of them against the world. When Evelyn's health began to fail, Lila gave up her dream of performing on bigger stages. She dropped out of music school and took to the train station, where she could make a little money and still do what she loved. Each day was a struggle, but Lila had never been one to shy away from a fight. She'd sing until her throat was raw if it meant bringing. There were nights when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. Nights when she'd return to their tiny apartment, her voice hoarse and her spirit bruised, to find her mother weaker than before. Evelyn was fading, and Lila could see it, even if she refused to acknowledge it fully. And then, there were the nightmares. They came often, clawing at her in the quiet hours before dawn. In them, Lila was trapped inside a burning car, smoke choking the air, flames licking at the edges of her vision. She could hear screams, sometimes they were her own, other times they belonged to a woman she didn't recognize. The heat was unbearable, the panic suffocating, and just as the fire seemed about to consume her, she'd wake up, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The nightmares left her shaken, their origins a mystery, but their effects very real. She could never quite shake the terror they left behind. Lila tried to ignore them, focusing instead on her music and her mother. But Evelyn, sharp as ever despite her illness, noticed the dark circles under her daughter's eyes, the way she flinched at sudden loud noises. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Evelyn would say, her voice frail, but filled with concern. "Promise me, Lila, promise me you'll stay safe. Only sing at the station where the security guards know you. It's not safe on the streets, especially not in the financial district." Lila would nod, reassuring her mother with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She knew Evelyn worried about her, but she didn't understand why the older woman was so insistent on this particular point. To Lila, it seemed simple enough. Her mother didn't want her out on the streets alone, where anything could happen. The station was a safer bet, with its constant flow of people and the familiar faces of the security staff. But as Evelyn's health deteriorated, the station's meager earnings began to feel insufficient. Lila's desperation grew with each passing day. She could see the toll the illness was taking on Evelyn, the way her mother's strength seemed to seep away a little more each morning. The doctors had been clear, without better treatment, Evelyn didn't have much time left. The words echoed in Lila's mind, a ticking clock she couldn't ignore. She started to think about other places to sing. The financial district was always bustling with businessmen and women who carried expensive briefcases and wore shoes that cost more than Lila made in a week. What if she could earn more money there? Just a few hours in the right spot could bring in more than a whole day at the station. The thought gnawed at her, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. One evening, after another disappointing day at the station, Lila found herself staring at her reflection in the grimy mirror of their bathroom. She looked tired, worn out, and there was something in her eyes that she didn't like, a desperation that hadn't been there before. Evelyn was asleep in the next room, her breathing shallow but steady. Lila knew she couldn't keep doing this, scraping by and hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. She needed to do more. She needed to take a chance. The next morning, she kissed her mother's forehead before heading out, her guitar slung over her shoulder. "I'll be at the station," she lied, the words heavy on her tongue. But as she stepped out into the crisp morning air, Lila made a decision. Today, she wouldn't go to the station. Today, she would try her luck on the streets, in the places where the money was. As she walked towards the financial district, a shiver ran down her spine. Lila pushed the feeling aside, telling herself it was just nerves. But deep down, a voice whispered that she was crossing a line, stepping into a world she wasn't prepared for. She ignored it. She had to. For her mother, she would do whatever it took. Even if it meant going against every instinct telling her to turn back. That was how Lila found herself standing on the corner of a busy street in the heart of the financial district, the imposing skyscrapers casting long shadows over her. She took a deep breath, strummed her guitar, and began to sing, her voice weaving through the noise of the city. As the first notes left her lips, Lila felt a strange mix of fear and hope, a thrill that she was doing something different, something that could change everything. The evening was just beginning to settle in, casting the city in shades of gold and amber as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lila's voice flowed through the streets, carried by a breeze that rustled the leaves of the trees lining the avenue. She was starting to get used to the rhythm of this new place, the way the city pulsed with energy, how people moved with purpose. It wasn't like the station, where she knew the faces, knew the people who would drop a coin or two without breaking stride. Here, the world felt different, faster, and somehow more dangerous. As she sang, pouring every bit of emotion she could into the lyrics, a sleek, black limousine rolled slowly down the street. Its tinted windows hid the world inside, but as it neared Lila, the driver brought the car to a gentle stop. The window slid down just a crack, and for a moment, Lila felt a pair of eyes on her, an unseen presence that made her skin prickle. She glanced up, mid-song, catching a glimpse of a pale hand resting on the edge of the window, but the car began to move again almost immediately, disappearing into the flow of traffic. She thought nothing more of it, focusing on the notes, on the story she was telling with her music. But inside that car, Mr. Graves sat back, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. There was something in that voice, something raw and real, that stirred a part of him he hadn't felt in years. "Pull over up ahead," he instructed his driver in a low voice, his mind already working through possibilities. When the car stopped again, he motioned to his assistant, a sharp-looking man who could blend into any crowd. "Find out who she is," Graves said, his tone brokering no argument. "And bring her to my office." Lila had just finished her set, her fingers lingering on the last chord, when the man approached her. He was dressed in a well-tailored suit, the kind that made you think of expensive cigars and boardrooms high above the city. "Miss," he called out, his voice smooth as he stepped closer. "A moment of your time, if you please." She looked up, wary but curious. It wasn't every day someone in a suit approached her like this. "Yes?" she asked, her hand still resting on the guitar's neck, as if it could somehow shield her from whatever was coming next. My employer was very moved by your performance, the man said, offering her a business card with an embossed name **Harlan Graves **. He'd like to discuss a business proposal with you. Would you be willing to meet with him? Lila hesitated, her mind racing. There was something about this that didn't sit right with her, but at the same time, the name on that card held weight. Maybe this was the break she had been hoping for, the chance to do something more, to finally get ahead. She thought of her mother, of the mounting bills, and nodded. All right, she agreed, her voice steady even as a flicker of unease curled in her stomach. The man smiled, gesturing to a nearby coffee shop. He'll meet you there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, Lila found herself walking into a dimly lit coffee shop, its air thick with the scent of roasted beans and a hint of vanilla. At a corner table, a man sat waiting for her, his presence somehow dominating the small space, despite his unassuming posture. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with sharp features softened only slightly by the lines of age. His dark suit was immaculate, and his eyes, pale blue, almost cold, locked onto her the moment she entered. "Miss Hart," he greeted, standing briefly as she approached the table. His voice was like velvet, smooth but with an undercurrent of something harder, something that set Lila on edge. "Please, sit." She sat, clutching her guitar case like a lifeline, her heart thudding in her chest. The unease she'd felt earlier hadn't dissipated, if anything, it had grown stronger. But she forced herself to stay calm, to appear composed. This man was clearly powerful, and if he was offering her something, she needed to listen. "I'm Harlan Graves," he began, his eyes never leaving hers. "I heard your performance earlier, and I must say, I was impressed. Your voice, it has a quality that's hard to find. Raw, emotional, genuine. It moved me in a way I haven't felt in a long time." Lila swallowed, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt inadequate. There was something about this man that unnerved her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Graves leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I'm prepared to make you an offer, Miss Hart. A substantial donation for your mother's treatment. In return, I'd like you to sing exclusively for me at some private gatherings I host. Small, intimate events. You'd be well compensated, of course." Her heart leapt at the mention of her mother. The thought of having the money they so desperately needed was tempting, almost too tempting. But there was something off about this whole situation. The way he spoke, the intensity of his gaze, it made her skin crawl. "What kind of gatherings?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Just a few select guests," Graves replied smoothly, but there was a glint in his eyes that Lila didn't like. "People of influence, who appreciate real talent. You wouldn't need to worry about anything else, just sing, and leave the rest to me." Lila's instinct screamed at her to say no, to walk away and never look back. But then she thought of her mother, of the doctor's bills, and the exhaustion that came from trying to hold everything together. She was out of options, and this man, however unsettling, was offering a solution. "I'll do it," she said, the words falling out of her mouth before she could second-guess herself. "But only for a short time. Until my mother's better." Graves smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he agreed, though Lila sensed there was more to it than he was letting on. "You'll find that I'm a man of my word, Miss Hart. I'll have my assistant handle the arrangements. We'll be in touch." The meeting ended as abruptly as it had begun, and Lila found herself back on the street, the business card still clutched in her hand. The city around her seemed colder, more distant, as if the shadows had grown longer since she'd stepped inside that coffee shop. As she walked away, a chill ran down her spine. She had made a deal with a man she didn't trust, for reasons that both terrified and compelled her. But she had no choice, this was for her mother. And so, Lila tried to push aside the lingering unease, focusing instead on the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the break they needed. The first time Lila entered Mr. Graves' mansion, she was struck by its grandeur. The building loomed over the street, its facade a blend of old-world charm and cold, modern lines. Inside, it was a different world. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and old money. She was ushered up a sweeping staircase by Graves' assistant, the sharp-suited man she'd met before. He led her to a room at the end of a long corridor, its door already ajar. "This will be your dressing room," he said, pushing the door open wider and motioning for her to enter. Lila stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The room was filled with clothes, racks upon racks of designer dresses in every imaginable color, rows of shoes lined up neatly along one wall, and a vanity table overflowing with high-end makeup and perfumes. It was like stepping into a dream, the kind of luxury she had never even imagined for herself. For a moment, all her doubts were drowned out by the sheer thrill of it. She walked over to the vanity, her fingers brushing lightly over the makeup brushes, the gold-tipped lipstick tubes. This was how it must feel to be a real star, she thought, to be someone who mattered. But as she stood there, admiring the room, a small voice at the back of her mind whispered that this wasn't her life. These weren't her clothes, and this wasn't her world. The unease she had felt since that first meeting with Graves crept back in, a chill she couldn't quite shake. She pushed the thoughts aside, reminding herself why she was doing this. Her mother needed her. And if performing at a few parties in a place like this could make a difference, then she would do it. She had no other choice. The parties themselves were as extravagant as the mansion. Each one was a spectacle, filled with the city's elite, business tycoons, celebrities, politicians. They moved through the grand ballroom with practiced ease, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of classical music that played from hidden speakers. Lila was always the centerpiece, her voice cutting through the chatter as she sang the songs Graves had selected for her. Each performance was flawless, she made sure of it, pouring every bit of her talent into the music. Graves provided everything she needed. Before each event, she would arrive at the mansion hours early, where she'd be left alone in the dressing room to choose her outfit and prepare. The wardrobe was unlike anything she had ever seen, elegant gowns, some so intricate they looked like they belonged in a museum, others sleek and modern, the kind of dresses that would turn heads on any red carpet. She'd spend hours getting ready, transforming herself into someone else, someone who belonged in this world of luxury and power. Yet, as much as the glamour excited her, it also left her feeling hollow. There was something off about the whole arrangement. She'd often catch a glimpse of herself in the mirror, dressed to the nines, and barely recognize the woman staring back at her. She was playing a part, and she knew it. But for whom? And why? Her unease only grew with each party. The guests were polite enough, but their eyes, especially the men's, held a strange hunger that made her skin crawl. They would watch her as she sang, their gazes lingering long after the last note faded. And when she wasn't performing, she would catch snippets of their conversations, cryptic references to deals and exchanges, things that didn't seem to fit with the casual air of a social gathering. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that these events were more than just parties. There was something secretive, almost ritualistic about them. The guests would arrive in staggered groups, as if by some unwritten schedule, and Graves was always at the center of it all, orchestrating the evening with a quiet authority. He never joined in the revelry, instead watching everything with those cold, pale eyes of his, as if he were measuring each person, calculating their worth. It was during one of these nights that Lila noticed something particularly strange. As she sang, she saw a man standing near the back of the room, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He wasn't dressed like the others, no expensive suit, no flashy jewelry. He looked out of place, almost like he didn't belong. But what caught Lila's attention most was the way he was staring at her. His eyes were intense, almost frantic, as if he was trying to communicate something important to her without words. She faltered, just for a moment, before quickly regaining her composure. When she looked back to where he had been standing, he was gone. After that, she started to notice more oddities. Conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by, knowing glances exchanged between guests, and most unsettling of all, the way Graves seemed to be aware of everything, as if nothing escaped his notice. He never spoke much during the parties, but his presence was always felt, an unspoken reminder of the power he held over everyone there, especially her. The room where she prepared for the performances, filled with clothes and makeup that fit her perfectly, began to feel less like a luxury and more like a carefully constructed trap. Why did Graves have all of this here, ready for her, even before she had agreed to his deal? And why was she the only performer at these gatherings, the sole source of entertainment for such influential people? The questions gnawed at her, but she was afraid to find the answers. Graves' generosity came at a price, and though she had agreed to the terms, she was beginning to realize just how steep that price might be. The parties were becoming less about the music and more about something else, something darker, hidden beneath the surface of the elegant facade. And Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just by the guests, but by something or someone much more sinister. As the weeks passed, her unease grew into a quiet dread. She couldn't deny that the money was helping her mother. Evelyn's condition had stabilized, the treatments becoming more effective as they could afford better care. But with each party, each night spent in that mansion, Lila felt herself slipping further away from the person she used to be, the person she recognized. One evening, after another performance that left her drained and shaken, Lila lingered in the dressing room, staring at herself in the mirror. The gown she wore was breathtaking, a deep shade of emerald that brought out the green in her eyes, but it felt like a costume. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, someone who existed only in this world of whispers and shadows. As she removed her makeup, she noticed a small smudge on the vanity mirror, just above where her reflection's hand rested. It was faint, almost invisible, but it looked like lipstick. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. For a moment, she could almost feel the chill of another presence in the room, something that sent a shiver down her spine. She pulled her hand back, the unease twisting in her gut. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something she couldn't quite understand. The next morning, Lila woke with a knot of dread in her stomach. The opulence of Mr. Graves' world had lost its initial allure, leaving only the nagging sense that she had stepped into something far darker than she'd ever imagined. She could no longer ignore the signs, the strange guests, the eerie quiet of the mansion after the parties, the whispers that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she knew about Mr. Graves. He was a man who kept his life carefully concealed behind layers of wealth and influence. She'd tried searching for information online, but the results were frustratingly sparse, just a few mentions of his business dealings, a couple of society pages from years ago, but nothing that painted a clear picture of who he really was. It was as if someone had deliberately scrubbed his past clean. That morning, after another sleepless night, she made up her mind to dig deeper. There was a library downtown, one she had visited occasionally as a child when her mother had still been well enough to take her. It was old, with thick wooden shelves and the smell of musty paper that had always comforted her. She figured it was a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, there would be something in the archives that could give her a glimpse into the man who now held her life in his hands. The library was nearly empty when Lila arrived, a few students scattered among the tables, and an elderly woman reading quietly in a corner. She went straight to the reference desk, where a librarian with graying hair and kind eyes greeted her with a warm smile. "Can I help you find something?" the librarian asked, adjusting her glasses. "Yes, actually," Lila replied, lowering her voice. "I'm looking for information on a man named Harlan Graves. Anything you might have in your archives." The librarian's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "We do have an extensive collection of old newspapers and records. Let me show you to the microfilm section." Lila followed her down a long corridor to a room filled with rows of microfilm readers. The librarian pointed her to a machine and then retrieved several spools of film from a nearby cabinet. "Start with these," she suggested. "These are local papers from the last few decades. If you need anything else, just let me know." "Thank you," Lila said, taking a seat at the machine. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the equipment as she began scrolling through the film. The first few hours yielded nothing of interest, old headlines about city politics, social events, and business deals. But then, she stumbled upon something that made her heart skip a beat. It was an article from nearly 20 years ago, a grainy black and white photo of a younger Harlan Graves standing beside a woman with dark hair and striking features. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance of Singer Isabella Rose Sparks Scandal." Lila's pulse quickened as she read the article. Isabella Rose had been a rising star in the music world, known for her stunning voice and captivating stage presence. She and Graves had been romantically involved, their relationship the subject of much speculation in the press. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, Isabella had disappeared. The last time she was seen was at a private event hosted by Graves himself. The article hinted at foul play, but no evidence was ever found to link Graves to her disappearance, and the case eventually went cold. Lila leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Was this the same room she had stumbled upon in the mansion, the one with the stain that looked like an old handprint? Was Isabella Rose the woman who had once lived in that space, only to vanish without a trace? The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. If Graves had been involved in Isabella's disappearance, then Lila might be in far more danger than she had ever imagined. Her instincts had been right, there was something sinister lurking beneath the surface of his charm, something she had been blind to because of her desperation. She sat there for a long time, staring at the flickering screen, unsure of what to do next. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to get as far away from Graves as possible. But then she thought of her mother, lying in a hospital bed, finally receiving the care she needed. If she left now, if she broke the deal with Graves, what would happen? The money would stop, and with it, any hope of saving her mother's life. Torn between fear and obligation, Lila's hands trembled as she gathered her things. She needed time to think, to figure out what her next move should be. But as she walked out of the library and back onto the bustling city streets, one thought consumed her: Graves wasn't just some wealthy benefactor. He was a man with a past, a man who had already destroyed one woman's life. And now, Lila wondered with dread, might she be next? Lila's anxiety had begun to feel like a second skin, something she wore day in and day out, its weight growing heavier with every passing moment. Despite the gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach, she kept telling herself that she was being paranoid. After all, the money she was making had transformed her mother's care. Evelyn's condition had stabilized, and for the first time in months, the doctors were optimistic. The better care and treatments were making a difference, and it was all thanks to Mr. Graves and his generous payments. But the gnawing sense of unease never left her. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation she'd had with Graves, every odd look from his guests. The mansion, once awe-inspiring, now felt like a gilded cage. Every time she crossed its threshold, a shiver ran down her spine, a constant reminder that she didn't belong in this world, and that maybe she was in over her head. One afternoon, Lila visited her mother at the hospital, bringing flowers and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Evelyn was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than she had in weeks. But as they talked, Evelyn's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She had always been perceptive, and Lila could see the wheels turning in her mind as she studied her daughter. "Where is all this money coming from, Lila?" Evelyn asked, her tone gentle but firm. I've been singing at different stations with more people," Lila said, choosing her words carefully. "They pay well, and it's helping with the bills." But Evelyn wasn't convinced. She knew her daughter too well, could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted away whenever the conversation drifted too close to the truth. "Lila, you're lying to me," Evelyn said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I can tell. Whatever you're involved in, it's not right. I don't need fancy treatments if it means you're putting yourself in danger." "Have you been singing on the streets?" Lila froze, the lie she had been living catching in her throat. She had been so careful, keeping the truth hidden behind vague explanations and hurried excuses. But now, faced with her mother's direct question, she realized just how fragile her deception was. I've been singing at private events," Lila said, choosing her words carefully. "They pay well, and it's helping with the bills." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Private events? What kind of events? And who's paying you?" Lila's heart pounded as she tried to find a way out of the conversation. "Just some wealthy people who appreciate live music. It's nothing dangerous, Mom. I promise." The words hit Lila like a punch to the gut. She had done everything she could to protect her mother, to shield her from the darker aspects of her life. But now, faced with Evelyn's concern, Lila realized the toll her secrets were taking. Her mother, who had been on the mend, suddenly seemed weaker, her breaths coming more labored, her eyes losing their spark. It was as if the truth, or the lack of it, was draining the life out of her. "No, Mom, please don't worry," Lila whispered, panic rising in her chest. "I'm doing this for you." But Evelyn shook her head, tears filling her eyes. Her voice broke, and her condition visibly worsened. As the monitor next to Evelyn's bed began to beat faster, Lila's panic turned to horror. The stress, the worry she had caused, was making her mother worse. Nurses rushed in, gently guiding Lila out of the room as they tended to Evelyn. She stood in the hallway, her heart in her throat, feeling like the world was crashing down around her. How could she have been so selfish? She had wanted to save her mother, but instead, she had only made things worse. Later that evening, after hours of waiting, a doctor finally emerged, his expression grim. "Your mother's condition has deteriorated," he said quietly. "She's going to need surgery, soon. We'll do everything we can, but it's a complicated procedure." Lila felt the room tilt as the words sank in. Surgery. Complicated. More money. More time. And all of it because she hadn't been honest. The guilt was suffocating, and she could barely breathe as she nodded, agreeing to whatever the doctor recommended. As she left the hospital, her mind was a whirlwind of fear and self-loathing. She had failed her mother in the worst possible way, and now, there was no turning back. A few days later, another event at Graves' mansion was looming. Lila dreaded going, but she was out of options. Desperation had a way of dulling fear, and she needed the money more than ever. When she arrived at the mansion that evening, Graves was waiting for her, his pale eyes studying her with a keen interest that made her skin crawl. "You seem troubled, Miss Hart," he said, his voice smooth as always. "Is there something you'd like to share?" Lila hesitated, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. My mother's condition has worsened. She needs surgery. It's going to be expensive. Graves' expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something that made Lila feel like a mouse caught in a trap. I see, he said slowly. I could help you with that, you know. Cover all the costs. Ensure your mother gets the best care available. Lila's heart leapt at the offer, but then he continued, his voice lowering as he leaned closer. But in return, I would require more of your time. You would need to move in here, to be available whenever I need you. No more running back and forth between your little apartment and the hospital. You would live here, as my guest. The implication was clear, she would be giving up her freedom, becoming a permanent fixture in his strange, secluded world. The very thought made her stomach turn. But what choice did she have? Her mother's life was on the line, and Lila was out of options. She looked at Graves, the man who held all the power, and felt a wave of disgust and fear wash over her. Yet, the desperation in her heart outweighed it all. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. I'll do it. Graves smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Good. I'll make the necessary arrangements. As Lila walked away, she felt the walls closing in around her. She had just signed away the last shred of control she had, placing herself entirely in Graves' hands. And she couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter what happened next, she would never be free of Harlan Graves. The surgery had been a success. That's what the doctors told Lila when she called the hospital to check on her mother's progress. Evelyn was stable, recovering well, and showing signs of improvement that they hadn't expected so soon. Relief washed over Lila, but it was tinged with the bitter realization that she couldn't be there. Mr. Graves had made sure of that. Since moving into the mansion, Lila's world had shrunk to the confines of its walls. The gilded cage she now inhabited was luxurious beyond measure, but it was still a cage. Graves' control over her life was absolute. Every movement was monitored, every interaction carefully orchestrated. The wardrobe and makeup she once admired now felt like chains, dressing her up for display at the endless stream of mysterious parties. She was a prized possession, her voice the entertainment, her presence a symbol of Graves' power. Days passed, each one blending into the next, the outside world slipping further and further away. Lila asked repeatedly to visit her mother, but there was always an excuse, a reason why she couldn't leave. The more she pushed, the tighter Graves' grip seemed to become. She felt like she was suffocating, drowning in a life that wasn't hers. Finally, after relentless pleading, Graves granted her a small mercy, permission to call her mother. But even this was tightly controlled. The call would be brief, monitored, and any breach of the rules would end it immediately. Desperate to hear her mother's voice, Lila agreed, swallowing her fear. When the call connected, and she heard Evelyn's voice on the other end, it took everything in Lila not to break down. Mom, how are you feeling? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Lila, where are you? Why haven't you come to see me? Evelyn's voice was laced with anxiety, each word a stab of guilt. I'm fine, Mom. I've just been busy, but I'm okay, Lila lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Busy? Lila, I know something's wrong. I can hear it in your voice. Please, tell me the truth. Come see me, why haven't you? Are you safe? Panic flared in Lila's chest, and before she could stop herself, she let Graves' name slip. Mom, please, don't worry about me, Mr. Graves is helping. The reaction on the other end was immediate. Lila, what was that name? Did you mean Graves? Evelyn's voice was frantic, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, Lila." But before Evelyn could finish, the line went dead, the connection severed abruptly. Lila stared at the phone in horror, realizing what had happened. Graves had been listening, and now, her mother's worst fears were about to be realized. The door to the room swung open, and there he stood, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What did I tell you about mentioning my name?" Graves' voice was cold, devoid of the charm he usually masked it with. "You've disobeyed me, Lila." "I'm sorry," Lila stammered, fear gripping her. "I didn't mean to." He snatched the phone from her hand, his grip crushing. "You don't need this anymore," he said, pocketing the device as if it were nothing more than a trinket. "You should focus on your duties here, not on the outside world." With that, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in Lila's heart. She was trapped, completely at his mercy, and there was nothing she could do. The phone call had been her last lifeline, and now even that was gone. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Evelyn's panic had escalated. Hearing Graves' name had triggered memories she had buried deep, memories she had hoped would never resurface. She had made a promise all those years ago, a promise that had kept her silent. But now, Lila's life was in danger, and Evelyn knew she had to act, even if it meant breaking that long-held vow. She reached for the phone beside her bed, her hand trembling. She hadn't dialed this number in over 20 years, hadn't even allowed herself to think about it. But as the phone rang, each tone dragging her back into a past she had tried to forget, she steeled herself for what was to come. The days at the mansion passed in a blur of isolation and fear. Lila's world had shrunk to the confines of a gilded suite, a luxurious prison where the windows offered only glimpses of the vast, manicured grounds. She was allowed out only for dinner with Mr. Graves, or to sing at the parties he held with disturbing regularity. The rest of the time, she was left alone, her only companions the haunting thoughts that circled her mind like vultures. But Lila was not one to remain idle, even in captivity. The more Graves tried to control her, the more she felt a burning need to understand him, to uncover the secrets that lurked in the shadowed corners of his life. She knew it was dangerous, knew she was risking everything by even considering defiance, but she couldn't help herself. There was something in this house, something that Graves was hiding, and she had to know what it was. Whenever she had a chance, Lila slipped out of her room, creeping through the endless corridors of the mansion. It was a labyrinth of opulence, with rooms filled with art and antiques that hinted at the vast wealth Graves commanded. But for all the beauty, there was an undercurrent of something darker, a sense that each room held memories better left forgotten. One day, after another stifling dinner with Graves where he spoke little and watched her too closely, Lila found an opportunity to explore further than she ever had before. The mansion was quiet, the staff occupied elsewhere, and she wandered down a hallway she hadn't seen before. At the end of it was a door, slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Lila hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The room inside was different from the others, less grand, more personal. The furniture was simple, the colors muted. It was a woman's room, she realized, with a dressing table, an ornate mirror, and a wardrobe that stood slightly open. Dust covered the surfaces, and the air was heavy, as if the room had been sealed off for a long time. But it was the wall that caught her attention. There, just above the headboard of the bed, was a stain. At first, it looked like an old watermark, darkened with age. But as Lila stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat. The stain was the outline of a hand, smeared across the wall, as if someone had pressed it there in desperation. It was faded, but unmistakable, a rusty, reddish-brown that could only be one thing. Blood. Lila's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The room spun, the horror of what she was seeing sinking in with a sickening weight. This had been someone's room, someone who had suffered, someone who had tried to escape. And Graves. Graves had something to do with it. She backed out of the room, her heart pounding, every instinct screaming at her to run. She fled down the hallway, her steps quick and silent, until she was back in the safety of her suite, the door closed firmly behind her. But there was no safety here, she realized, not anymore. The mansion was a beautiful nightmare, and Graves was its master. Who had lived in that room? Was it Isabella Rose, the singer who had vanished all those years ago? The thought twisted in Lila's gut, making her feel sick. She had to get out, had to escape, before she became the next woman to disappear within these walls. But as the next party approached, Lila knew she couldn't show any sign of fear. Graves was too perceptive, too controlling. If he suspected anything, it would be the end. So she dressed as she always did, in one of the elaborate gowns he provided, her makeup flawless, her expression calm. She was an actress now, playing the role he demanded of her. The party was like the others, filled with wealthy, powerful people who mingled and whispered, their eyes always drifting toward her. She sang as she was expected to, her voice carrying through the grand hall, but her mind was elsewhere, still trapped in that room with the bloody handprint. Then, as she finished one song and began another, she noticed something different. A commotion near the back of the room, subtle at first but growing louder. Murmurs turned into sharp whispers, and then into shouts. The crowd began to part, people moving aside as if clearing a path for someone important. Lila's heart raced as she tried to keep singing, her eyes darting toward the source of the disturbance. And then she saw her, a woman, standing tall and defiant, facing Graves with an expression of pure hatred. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Graves' face was a mask of anger and surprise, but there was something else there too, fear. The woman stepped forward, and Lila saw her more clearly now. She was older than herself, but not as old as her mother, her face showed a few lines and her hair was starting to show a few streaks of gray, but there was something strikingly familiar about her. The woman's eyes locked onto Lila's, and in that moment, everything stopped. Lila knew, with a bone-deep certainty, who this was. The realization hit her like a wave, overwhelming and undeniable. And everything went black. Lila's head throbbed as she slowly regained consciousness. She could feel the vibrations of a car beneath her, the soft hum of the engine thrumming through her body. Blinking against the dim light, she realized she was lying in the back seat of a moving vehicle. The world outside the windows was dark, the sky tinged with the last hints of twilight. She bolted upright, panic gripping her chest. How long had she been out? It was evening now, but how could that be? The last thing she remembered was standing in the grand hall, singing at one of Graves' parties, then seeing that woman, and everything going black. The low murmur of voices drew her attention to the front of the car. Two women were seated in the driver and passenger seats, their faces partially illuminated by the dashboard lights. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she recognized them, her mother, Evelyn, and the woman from the party, the one who had confronted Graves. The one who had looked at her with eyes that seemed to carry a lifetime of sorrow. Lila's mind raced, trying to piece together how this was possible. Why was her mother with this woman? And why did something deep inside her respond to this stranger with a mixture of fear and an inexplicable, almost primal connection? As if sensing Lila's eyes on them, the woman in the passenger seat turned around, meeting Lila's gaze with a look that was equal parts relief and pain. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice tinged with an accent that Lila couldn't quite place. "We didn't know how long it would take." Evelyn glanced over at the woman, her expression conflicted, before turning to Lila with a tenderness that only deepened Lila's confusion. "Lila, sweetheart, I know you have a million questions," she began, her voice trembling slightly. And I promise, we'll answer all of them. But first, we need to get somewhere safe. Safe? Lila repeated, her voice hoarse. What's going on? Who is she? She pointed to the woman, who still hadn't taken her eyes off Lila. The car turned onto a narrow dirt road, flanked by dense trees that rose up like sentinels, casting long shadows across the path. We're almost there, the woman said, her tone soothing but firm. Once we arrive, we'll explain everything. I know this is overwhelming, but you're safe now. That's what matters. Lila's pulse raced as the car wound its way deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around them until they finally emerged into a clearing. Before them stood a large, old-fashioned house, its wooden frame weathered by time but still sturdy, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The only light came from the house's windows, casting a warm glow that felt both inviting and mysterious. As the car came to a stop, Lila's mind whirled. Who was this woman? And why was her mother acting as though this stranger was someone she trusted? Fear and curiosity waged a battle within her as the two women got out of the car and opened her door. Come inside, Lila, her mother said gently, holding out a hand to help her out. We'll explain everything. The three of them walked up the steps and into the house, the door closing behind them with a soft click that sounded far too final for Lila's liking. The interior was warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke and something sweet, like lavender, or maybe honey. It was a stark contrast to the cold grandeur of Graves' mansion, and yet it did little to calm the storm inside Lila's chest. The woman led them to a cozy sitting room, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. She gestured for Lila to sit on a plush, worn sofa. Evelyn settled beside her, taking her hand and holding it tightly. The woman, however, remained standing, her posture tense as she stared at Lila with an intensity that made Lila's throat tighten. Finally, the woman spoke. Lila, my name is Isabella Rose. The name hit Lila like a physical blow. Isabella Rose. The singer who had disappeared years ago, the woman whose story had been tangled with Graves' dark past. The woman who, Lila suddenly realized, looked almost like an older version of herself. Isabella Rose? Lila echoed, her voice shaky. But, you vanished. Everyone thought you were dead. Isabella nodded slowly, her eyes filled with an emotion that Lila couldn't quite name. That's what we wanted everyone to think. It was the only way to escape him, to protect you. Me? Lila felt like she was falling into a deep chasm, her thoughts spinning out of control. What do you mean, protect me? Evelyn squeezed Lila's hand, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears. Lila, there's something I need to tell you, she said, her voice breaking. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was too afraid. Too afraid of what it would mean for you, for all of us. Lila stared at her mother, or the woman she had always thought was her mother, with a growing sense of dread. What are you saying? Isabella knelt in front of Lila, taking her other hand. Evelyn isn't your mother, Lila, she said gently, her voice laced with a sorrow that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. I am. I'm your birth mother. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Lila felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her, leaving her suspended in a void of disbelief. No, she whispered, shaking her head as if she could will away the truth. No, that's not possible. It is, Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with regret. I'm your grandmother, Lila. I raised you because Isabella had to disappear. We had to make everyone believe she was dead so that you would be safe from Graves. He was obsessed with her. When she tried to leave him, he threatened to take you from her. So we staged the car accident you've always had nightmares about. It was the only way to keep you hidden from him. Lila's head spun as the memories of those nightmares surfaced, the burning car, the screams, the overwhelming terror. They weren't just dreams. They were memories, buried deep in her subconscious, of the day her life had been ripped apart and reshaped into a lie. "Why now?" Lila asked, her voice trembling with the weight of everything she was learning. "Why tell me all this now?" Isabella's eyes darkened, her grip on Lila's hand tightening. "Because Graves found you. Despite everything we did, he found you. And I couldn't let him take you from me again. That's why I came to the party. That's why we're here now." Lila felt tears welling up in her eyes, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and confusion flooding her heart. Everything she had known, everything she had believed about her life, was crumbling around her. But as she looked into Isabella's eyes, so like her own, she felt something else too, a flicker of hope. A chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from them both. "But how did you get me out?" Lila asked, needing to understand. Isabella exchanged a glance with Evelyn before answering. "We had help. Old friends who owed me favors. They made sure you were safe, but we had to keep you sedated for your own protection until we could get away. Graves won't stop looking for you, Lila, but you're safe here. We'll figure out what to do next, together." Lila nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. The weight of the truth was heavy, but it was a burden she knew she could bear with these two women by her side. They had been through so much, sacrificed so much, to keep her safe. As they sat together in the warmth of the house, Lila allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe they could finally find peace. The past had been cruel, but the future was still unwritten, and together, they could start to heal the wounds that Graves had inflicted on them all. They lived on, in that remote place, a family forged by survival and bound by a love that had endured the darkest of times. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lila allowed herself to imagine a future free from the shadow of Harlan Graves.